thank you. I'll give you a brief introduction to myself first, and that will give you a chance to tune into my Scottish accent. Okay? I'll try hard to speak slowly, but in Scotland, just like Spain, we speak very quickly normally, so if I speak too fast, just tell me to slow down. Just shout, slow down. Okay? My name is Brian Boyd, and I started teaching in 1970. I'm looking around the room, and there's a fair proportion of people who were probably not born in 1970. You were? Yeah. It doesn't look. So anyway, all that means is that I'm very wise. And I've got lots of things to say that are very, very important to you to listen up. What was very nice was when I walked in here today, I do a lot of speaking to teachers in Scotland, and it was nice to see that in Finland, teachers always sit at the back of a room. You walk in, they sit at the back. Right? It's only the ones who are late who come in and sit at the front. So it's nice to know there's something the same about Scotland and Finland. Okay? So we're here as part of a project, as you know, the Erasmus project, and this was a talk that we had scheduled to do, and it's nice that the staff of this school have come along to listen. So I'll take maybe about half an hour or so, and in the course of that, if there are any questions you want me to ask immediately, just ask them. And if you want to wait till the end and ask questions, then that'll be okay too. Okay? Any questions before we start? No? Right, okay, now, we're here in Finland. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Finland is always held up in our country as the best education system in the universe, in the known universe. Not just the world, not just Europe, but it's the best system. So, the reason for that is because it does very well in international comparisons. So the OECD, for example, who go around and look at all the country systems, regularly tell us that Finland has the best education system in the world. So we are really interested to see just how that looks. All the other systems that I know of have their own strengths and weaknesses. So what I'm going to try and do just now is use my experience as a teacher and as a researcher to look at a particular aspect of learning and teaching. And we've called it, for the sake of today, the pupil voice. Now historically, when I was a pupil at school, the pupil voice was silent most of the time. The only voice that could be heard would be the teacher's voice, and the pupils would occasionally, when prompted, give an answer, which would be either correct or incorrect. Now I would like to suggest to you, and I know you already believe this anyway, that that's possibly not the best way of encouraging learning. And I'm going to suggest that in a classroom, the pupil voice should be heard far more often, and it should be heard as part of collaborative learning. Now this morning, not all of you heard your colleagues from this school talk about one or two little projects that were involved in, little bits of action research. One was on role play, one was in group learning, one was in group homework. So, almost all education systems, I think, now believe that pupils should be actively engaged in learning, and we should be listening to the pupil voice more regularly. So I'm going to try and make the case for that using a number of different aspects of education. So just hoping this works. It does. So this is what we call in the jargon an advanced organiser. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. And if I stray off my agenda, you can tell me that I've lost my way. But I'm going to try and look at the importance of talking and listening as part of learning. Historically, reading and writing were the two things that were regarded as the most important aspects of education. I'm going to suggest that talking and listening are more important, especially in the early years, for improving learning. I want to look at how children can be more actively engaged in learning rather than passive. So how do we get them involved, engaged? Maybe how do we get them even outside the building to be learning, not just in the classroom? We had a really excellent talk this morning from Sweden about youngsters from the age of 3 to 6 out in the forest learning, and how the forest contributed to the learning in a way that the classroom maybe couldn't do. I want to suggest too that if we want to know if our school is doing a good job, one group of people we need to listen to is the pupils. Very often, if you want to know what's happening in the school, then don't just ask the teachers, don't just ask the parents, let's engage the pupils in asking them questions about what helps them learn, what are the things they do that make learning more interesting, more engaging, and so on. And finally, looking at how involving children in learning can contribute to the democratic process. Some of you may know that we had a referendum recently in Scotland. In fact, we were in Sweden 3 months ago, just a few days after the referendum. And those of us who wanted Scotland to be independent, we were devastated. We were crying, sobbing, and very upset that we didn't vote for independence. But the really interesting thing about the referendum was that more than 85% of the population voted. That was democracy. Democracy in action. And not only that, young people from the age of 16 and 17, for the first time, were allowed to vote. So, for me, democracy is something to be treasured. It's something that's under threat at the moment in some parts of the world. And I would suggest if we want democracy to be strong, then we need to start really, really early and get young people engaged in democratic decision-making, even in preschool, as you were saying earlier. Okay, does that seem all right? Is that an agenda? Okay. If you fall asleep, by the way, it's okay. It's okay. As long as you don't snore, it's not a problem. Okay, if you want to snooze. Okay. Oops, I've just gone in the wrong direction. Okay, so let's talk about talking and listening itself. It seems to me that one of the biggest learning episodes that human beings go through happens before they come to school, before they come to nursery, and that's acquiring language. And language is acquired in a number of different ways, not least by listening, by trying to repeat, by experimenting with language. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Noam Chomsky, who's an American academic who did a lot of work on language development. But one of his breakthrough moments was when he realized through observation that very young children do a lot of repeating very early on. But at some point or other, quite early on, young people take the words that they've heard and then put them into a sentence which they've never heard before. In other words, they use words creatively. Suddenly, just by taking the words they've heard other people say, they put them together in a way that nobody's ever done to them. And Chomsky concluded from that human beings, the brain, is hardwired for language. As human beings, that's part of what makes us different from the rest of the animal kingdom. So in a sense, what we as educators need to do is to make language central to the process of learning. I'll talk a wee bit later on about another academic called Lev Vygotsky, a Russian, some of you are nodding already. And he again suggested that learning takes place through social interaction. Social interaction promotes cognitive development, was what he said. And I think I mentioned to some of you before, my wife, who's also a teacher, she usually gets to the heart of the matter. And she said, if you take Lev Vygotsky's words, what he really means is, talking makes you clever. Talking makes you clever. And that's why she believes that women are more intelligent than men. That's what she thinks. Because they talk more. They talk about serious things and feelings and emotions and stuff like that. So in a sense, it's just about making sure that we never lose sight of the fact that learning is at the heart of the matter. And at every opportunity, no matter what age or stage the young people are at, we should be finding ways of engaging them through language and giving them greater and greater opportunities to use language in different situations, different contexts, through role play, all sorts of other things, but making language really, really important. And the development of their language will develop their cognitive abilities at the same time. There's also an issue too, I think, about the aims of education. If I had more time and we were making this a whole afternoon session, I would put you into little groups and I would ask you to take 10 minutes to come up with the 4 most important aims of education. right? And then we can have a debate. But we don't have that time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 4 aims of education, not that I've made up, but that UNICEF, the international body that looks at education, come up with 4 aims for education that would apply globally, wherever young people were, whatever state of development the country was in. And the aims were very short, easy to remember, and they all included the word learning. Okay, so the first one was learning to know. Second one, learning to do. Third one, learning to live together. And the fourth one, learning to be. Interesting, isn't it? Very short, easy to remember. The only problem that I have with them is that I would change the order. And I would say learning to be should be the first one. Then learning to live together, learning to do, and learning to know would be the fourth. Because the learning to know bit is the kind of easy bit. You just fill your head full of stuff, facts, things. But it doesn't mean that there's deep learning. It doesn't mean that there's understanding. You can maybe win money on a quiz show on television by having lots of bits of information, but it doesn't mean you've understood it. Learning to do, now that's when you know if someone has really understood something. When they can apply the learning, they can take what they've learned and use it. Use it in a new situation. Learning to live together, I think, is about interpersonal relationships. And if you look across the world at the moment, the whole world, that's the aspect of learning we really need to concentrate on. Because there's a lot of aspects of the world, of different countries, religions, cultures, that don't seem to be talking to each other, or even seem to be killing each other. So learning to live together becomes crucial, but learning to be is where we start. Who am I? What is it to be a human being? Why am I here? The big existentialist questions. What kind of learner am I? What's the kind of learning that comes naturally to me? And therefore, what kinds of learning do I need to work hard at if I'm going to do it? And some people say to me, oh, I'm hopeless with languages, I can't learn languages. I'm not very good at maths. And I certainly can't ski. This kind of stuff, people quite often will say, I can't do this. And you think, well, really? Is that so? Have you really been given an opportunity to develop that? Could you pick it up? As people of our age, could we pick up new skills? Are we too old to learn? So there's all sorts of challenges, but learning to be, I think, is maybe the starting point for learning. And the being part of being an individual, I think, starts with your acquisition of language. That's where language comes into this. So the development of self, developing yourself and through interaction with others. That's where language comes into it. So, if you want to justify spending time when talking and listening, then you could argue, and I would argue as a former English teacher, that reading and writing is a spin-off from talking and listening. Quite often parents will say to me, how can I help my children learn effectively? How can I help them do better at school? In fact, I was invited along to a meeting not that long ago in a primary school. All the parents were there. Now, there were a lot of men in the audience too, who'd been taken along by their wives to listen to me speaking. But there was a football match on television that evening, a Champions League match, and I knew that most of the men did not want to be where they were. They wanted to be home watching, but their wives had encouraged them, dragged them, threatened them, got them along. So I said to them jokingly, okay, you want me to talk to you about how to help your children become better learners. I can do it in 30 seconds or I can do it in 45 minutes. Which would you prefer? So of course all the men would say 30 seconds. Well, it's easy. 30 seconds, if you want children to be successful learners, then one of the things you can say is talk to them. Talk with them. Talk to other people in front of them. Read to them. Read with them. Let them see you reading. All of the things that we now know as parents are good ideas. If every single child coming to every school in the world came from a family which did all those things, then it would be so much easier for them to learn and for us to teach. So in a sense, one of the challenges we have in Scotland is that we still have, even in the 21st century, pockets of poverty in our cities. Places where there are problems with drug misuse, there are people haven't worked for generations in the family, where it may not be absolute poverty, but it's comparative poverty, where children aren't spoken to, aren't read to, where there are no books in the house, and so on. So if we wanted really to transform children's fortunes, then a lot of the things would include talking and listening, reading, and so on. Okay? Now, I've not had any questions yet. I assume that you're all asleep, or I'm doing okay at the moment, so remember, please chip in. I've done it again, haven't I? Done it again. Can't work these things. Okay, so let me talk a wee bit then about children. I thought I would start with a little bit of Scots. The top line there is something that will make no sense to anyone apart from 4 of us in this room. It's a little bit of old Scottish dialect, and it sounds like I tell't ye, I tell't ye. And what it means, if we want to translate it into English, is I told you, I told you. Now that's what teaching used to be like in Scotland when I was a pupil. The teacher told you, and you did it. Okay? So I'm suggesting that won't do for the 21st century. That's not the relationship we're looking for. There's another little quotation I read when I was a very young teacher. When I was a young teacher and teaching in a secondary school, there was no group work, no collaborative learning took place in secondary schools in 1970. And as an English teacher, I was supposed to develop children's language by having them sitting in silence the whole time listening to me. So I thought, that doesn't make sense. I'm going to put them into groups. But I knew that it wouldn't be popular, so I better do a bit of reading so I could justify it. And I came across a little rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb was this. In most classrooms in 1970, there was talk going on for 2/3 of the time. 2/3 of that talk was teacher talk. And 2/3 of the teacher talk was direct influence. In other words, giving orders, asking questions, giving instructions, right? Not the kind of talk that we are discussing at the moment. Now, I would imagine that that's no longer the case. That rule of 2/3 probably would not be appropriate now. It would probably just be a rule of 50% maybe, something like that. It's changed a bit, but it hasn't changed enough. So in other words, talking is important, but there are certain kinds of talking that are much more likely to improve learning than others. And simply as a teacher standing in front of a class doing all the talking, well, it's not going to do it. Not every child will be able to learn in that particular way. So, questioning and dialogue seem to me to be critical. And dialogue is different from questioning because it doesn't imply that one person knows the answer and the other person has to try and find that answer. Dialogue means there's much more of a discussion. There's much more of recognising that there's more than one perspective. In fact, most of the important questions you might ever ask someone probably doesn't have a single answer. It will have a number of answers, depending on your perspective. So, making sure that what happens in the class is a genuine dialogue, and that the teacher isn't dominating things. I used to be involved in teacher education at the university that I worked in. And I used to say to the young people before they became teachers, I used to warn them about what they were about to do. I would say to them, are you sure you want to be a teacher? Have you thought this one through? Do you know that when you become a teacher, you join an exclusive club? And the club is that you will become one of a group of people who spends most of the time asking other human beings questions to which you already know the answer. Yeah, you do, don't you? Pupils, you ask them questions and you know the answer. You're just testing. And not only do you know the answer, you know one answer, and it's the answer you want to get. Right? And you spend as much time as it takes to make sure. And it's almost as if you're saying to the children, well, children, I have an answer in my head. Can you guess it? Isn't it? It's not really a question. It's just a charade, isn't it? So, we're talking about real questions, open questions, questions which don't have a single answer. For example, what colour is the sky? Children, what colour is the sky? And you want the hands to go up, don't you? And you're expecting blue. Blue? Not for about 6 months of the year in Scotland, it's not. It's not. And anyway, does the sky have a colour? Does it? I'm not not sure if it does, actually. Pink? Pink? It could be pink.
Because I like pink.
Yeah, that's as good a reason as any. So, my point in a sense is that if you look at the role of questioning in a classroom, then you immediately look at the role of the teacher in the classroom. Because if the teacher is dominating the questions, then the chances are that you're narrowing down the options in terms of answers, because you've already got an answer in your head somewhere. So I would suggest that if someone wants to become a teacher, what you need to be able to do is to find ways of allowing questions to be generated from different sources. So in other words, the children can develop the questions, they can do it in groups, as someone was talking about this morning. They can produce a question in a group for another group in the class, or for you, or for somebody else. So the questioning is something which is important, but the kind of questioning and the source of the question changes, depending on the kind of learning you want to have. Collaborative learning is something we've been looking at as part of the Erasmus project. And as I mentioned to you earlier, it wasn't a feature when I started teaching, certainly in secondary schools. I'm now working with a secondary school in the town where I live, and all of its associated primary schools. And we're trying to improve the continuity of learning from primary across to secondary. We're trying to engage all of the young people and help them to fulfil their potential. And what we're beginning to realise is that the primary schools in Scotland and the nurseries do a lot of collaborative learning. 80% maybe of learning is done collaboratively, and yet secondaries are scared of it. They're frightened of collaborative learning. They think they'll lose control if you allow the children to be actively engaged. So what we're now doing, in fact I'll be doing it in a couple of weeks' time when I go home, we're having what we call an in-service day, when all of the schools close and they come together. Well, they have opportunities for staff development. Then all of the staff from all of the secondary, 5 associated primaries, 3 nurseries, 1 school for young people with additional support needs, all the staff are coming together in one place. And we're having an in-service day, and we're going to be looking at collaborative learning from nursery right through to secondary. I'm really excited by it. I think it's going to be great, but it's the first time it's happened in that particular area. So, looking at collaborative learning seriously, looking at how people do it with children from age 3 to 6, and look at how you would do it with 17 and 18-year-olds. It would be different, but there would be certain principles which would be the same. So, that'll be interesting. And I think too, one of the things about learning that you see in very young children, but not so much quite often with older children in a school setting, is that exploratory nature of learning. Exploring learning with others. And if we can keep that spirit of exploration, then the chances are we can keep children's love of learning going for longer. Quite often meet young people, adolescents in secondary schools, who've more or less given up on learning. Don't think it's important, don't think it's interesting. So, if the topic isn't interesting, let's find a way of making it interesting. And let's engage them through collaborative learning as one way of doing it. Okay? Okay, now, one of the things I thought I would just have a little bit of fun with you. If you mind having a wee bit of fun? Is it okay to have fun? Yeah. Okay, I just wasn't sure. We're all looking very serious now. One of the things I got involved in about 20 years or so ago as an academic was the issue of school improvement. How do you improve schools? Schools are constantly wanting to be better at what they do. How would you know if a school was effective in doing what it was wanting to do? So one of the things we did was we went to visit schools across the United Kingdom, primary schools, secondary schools, and nursery schools. And we asked staff, pupils, parents, and people who live near the school, we asked them lots of questions about what makes a good school. But we spent also quite a long time asking the pupils, what makes a good teacher? What makes a good teacher? Okay? So, if you could take 30 seconds with the person next to you, can you agree with that person one characteristic of a good teacher? Just one. You know, I'm only giving you 30 seconds and I'm going to be strict. Just one characteristic of a good teacher. Now, do it. One that we agree with. One. Okay, that's 30 seconds up. Okay, 30 seconds. Now, this should be interesting because we've got a group of people who are much more mixed group of people than I would normally be doing this kind of thing with. I can normally predict that there'll be a certain amount of consistency in what you say. You'll have different things, but most people will agree with each other. So I wonder if that will be the case across maybe 6 countries. So who would like to just throw in the first characteristic? Just for you. Yes.
Loving person.
A loving person.
Is that so the children trust you?
Okay, a loving person whom the children trust. Okay, let's keep a hold of that.
Yeah.
A creative person. Okay, an effective teacher is a creative person. Okay?
Good listener.
A good listener. Right? Good listener. Okay, most people are still nodding, right?
Willing to learn.
Willing to learn. So the teacher is willing to learn, as well as the pupil. So the teacher as a learner. Okay? Humour, sense of humour. Yeah. Yeah, I'm of the view if you don't have a sense of humour, don't be trouble. Go and do something else. Seriously. You will never get through a day if you don't have a sense of humour. Right? Okay, any more? Patience. Patience. Some people would go further and say the patience of a saint. You must be saintly. Patience, yeah. Patience is important, yes.
Inspiring.
Inspiring. Someone who inspires others. Okay?
Fear.
Fear. Someone who's fair. It's interesting when you ask children the question I've just asked you, fairness comes very high up their list of priorities. And what they mean by that is that teachers don't have favourites, or if they do, they don't show it. Right? It's about that kind of fairness of treatment, whether it's boys and girls or people who are more intelligent than others or whatever. Fairness is a big issue for them. One more.
Sometimes try to think as a child, to become a child.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, think as a child. In other words, try and hold on to that bit of you that still remembers childhood. Yeah, interesting. So anyway, we asked these questions to a range of pupils across the UK. Now, there are some slight differences depending on the age of the children. You get different perspectives. So we asked a number of children who were at just the transition of preschool into primary school. And this is where you get a bit of humour if you want to do research of this kind. One little girl said that a good teacher smells nice. It smells nice. Now I think if you're about 4 years of age, that becomes quite important, actually, isn't it? You want your teacher to smell nice. The other one was, a good teacher is brave. I thought that was great, actually. I mean, we know as teachers, don't we? But I know most people here now are experienced teachers. But can you think back to your first couple of years in teaching? Can you remember the fear that you experienced as you walked into that class and thought, they're all looking at me, you know, this kind of thing. I mean, there is a fear element, but a good teacher is brave. Someone who goes into that classroom every day of every week, doesn't matter what happened at the weekend, you're still in there. But to be serious for a second, we asked, we collated all of the answers that we got, and we made a list of characteristics of a good teacher. We showed it to one of the teachers in the project, and she said it sounded like a description of Mother Teresa. In other words, you'd have to be a saint to do all these things. But I'll not read them all, but I'll read a couple of them, and you'll see the overlap. A good teacher is kind. A good teacher is generous. A good teacher listens to you. A good teacher encourages you. Now listen to this one. A good teacher has faith in you. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's quite strong. Yeah. It's not just that they believe in you, not just that they think, okay, has faith in you. Even when all seems lost, it doesn't look as though you can learn anything. You can't understand that science at all. Has faith in you. It just keeps going. And there's a whole long list, but it gets some quite interesting one. A good teacher cares for your opinion. And here's the best one of all. A good teacher makes you feel clever, makes you feel intelligent. Now, let me ask you a question. I don't know if this will apply to you, but certainly apply to me. Can you remember from your own school days as a pupil, teachers who made you feel stupid? I can remember some. I can remember some. I can remember a teacher saying to me, across a class, Boyd, didn't bother to call me my first name, Boyd. Boyd, you're a pinhead. Now, a pinhead in Scottish means that your brain is about the size of the head of a pin.
Oh.
That's what he said to me in front of a class. I was mortified. I was so upset. I thought I was actually quite intelligent, actually. Boyd, you're a pinhead.
But you proved them wrong.
I proved him wrong, and actually, I met him years and years later. He was a head teacher of a school, and I had just become a head teacher of a school nearby, and I reminded him. So, still a pinhead, I said to him. But he just looked embarrassed. He didn't change his mind. So, in a sense then, what I'm trying to say is that, to be serious, if we really want our schools to be better places, if we really want to do things which improve them, I think it's important to encourage the children to contribute to that discussion. Because actually, they often have very interesting observations to make about things. I did some research in a group of schools where Scotland had just produced a policy on including young people in mainstream schools who in the past might have been in separate special needs schools. And it was controversial, particularly because some of the youngsters' behaviour wasn't always good. So we went into schools, we asked the pupils about how it felt to be in a class with youngsters who were misbehaving, and we kind of assumed that the more intelligent pupils would say, we don't like these children, they should go away somewhere. But they didn't. They didn't. They were very sympathetic to most of the youngsters who were causing difficulty. In fact, they often said, sometimes it's not the pupil who's the problem. It's not always the pupil who causes the incident in the class. So in a sense, sometimes pupils can be very insightful. Most of the time, 95% of the time, pupils will give you the answers you want to hear because most pupils like school. They do. Across the world, most people like school. But there's about 5% of the time when you ask them a question, they'll give you an answer which is shocking to you or that you don't like. I was telling Lorraine, I've got a good friend who is a head teacher of a secondary school. It's a very good secondary school. It serves an area of economic disadvantage. This head teacher works really hard to include all of the children, whether they're intelligent or whether they're struggling and so on. And they have a mission statement rather than a set of aims. And the last line, the last bullet point says, in this school, all pupils are equally valued. That's what it says. All pupils are equally valued. However, each year in the school, the head teacher gives all of the pupils a questionnaire to complete, just on aspects of learning. And one of the questions she asked was, are all of the statements in the mission statement true? From your perspective, do you think they're true? And 75% of the pupils said no to that one. Pupils are not valued equally in the school. Some pupils are valued more than others. That was a shock, a real shock to the head teacher. And she went back and had a look at what it was that was going wrong. Why were some pupils feeling that? Who were the pupils who were more valued? Can you guess? Who were the pupils who were valued more than others?
The brighter ones.
Huh?
The brighter ones.
Yeah, the brighter ones who were more intelligent. The sweeter ones, the ones who smiled a lot. In our case, in our system, the ones who always wore the school uniform. They always were nice and clean and tidy. The ones who, again in our situation, who are more middle class than the other ones. One pupil said to me, one of the things you have to make sure that if you want to be valued in the school, it's better if you haven't got a big brother or sister who's been excluded from the school before, right? And one other pupil said, yeah, or a mother. Her mother had been excluded from the school when she was a pupil. So there was all of that going on. But the interesting thing was that the school, the head teacher of the school, had no awareness of the fact that that's what people thought until she asked the question. And once she asked the question, she could then address the issue. So, sometimes asking pupils questions will tell you a lot about the school, a lot about the effectiveness of the school that you would miss if you leave them out, if you only ask the staff or the parents. There's an issue too, I think, about children. One of the things they often say about a good teacher is someone who's approachable. And what they usually mean by that is it's someone that you feel safe in saying, I don't understand this. I don't understand this bit of maths or science or whatever. And what you hope is the teacher will be sympathetic and will try to help you learn it in a different kind of way. So the issue about understanding, which came up in this morning's sessions, is a really important one, because sometimes children appear unable to understand something. You know, you do your best, don't you? You spend ages trying to teach it really well, and they still don't get it. So what do? You just say, you just give up. I mean, in the example from my own case as a pupil was, I had done mathematics up until the age of 16, passed the national examination at that point. But the next stage was the next national examination, and I knew that this was going to be difficult for me. But the school didn't bother asking me. I had to go into the maths class. Luckily enough, the teacher in the maths class was also the teacher who took the football team. And I was a player in the football team, so I knew him and I could trust him. So anyway, he came in one day and he put on the blackboard, as it was in those days, dy by dx. Now, those of you who know anything about maths will know that's calculus. That's hard, difficult stuff. So he gave the lesson, and I listened intently. I knew he was speaking English, because I could hear the words, but I had no idea what he was talking about. And then at the end, he said, okay, go and do the first 10 examples, and I sat there, looking stupid, basically. So he came up to me and said, what's wrong with you, Brian? Why aren't you getting started? I said, sir, I don't understand this. Which bit don't you understand? I said, I don't understand any of it. And his response was, right, okay, why don't you go and do Spanish? That's what he did, seriously. I mean, he didn't say, well, let's look at other ways of learning it, or let's look at your multiple intelligences or your learning styles. Go and do Spanish. He said, well, I have to say, I did go and do Spanish. And I did Spanish, and I can still speak a bit of Spanish. But he should have tried harder, shouldn't he? He should have looked at some other ways. So, trying to look at other ways of helping somebody to learn. The issue of homework came up this morning. I had no idea it was going to come up. I just had this in the slide. But I mean, homework is a controversial thing where we come from, because schools think giving more and more homework makes the school better. And a lot of homework is of dubious value. It's not always clear how it helps the learning. But some homework can be very helpful. And one of the examples we had this morning from your own school is not always giving the homework as an individual task. You can give it as a group task. So it becomes more responsibility for getting it right, and also more perspectives and more suggestions, more ideas and so on. So all of this kind of thing is worth thinking about. And if we're not sure whether homework is a good thing, let's ask. Ask the pupils what they think of it. Ask the parents what they think of it. I can always give you an insight into how the school is working. Okay, now let's get to democracy. Now I know we're pushing the boat out a bit here. We can't really prepare for democracy only in schools. Democracy is wider than simply the education system. But these are the 4 aims of the Scottish curriculum. I thought I would just share with you. These are the things that we feel schooling ought to be able to achieve for every single youngster. So we think at the end of schooling, young people should be a good way towards becoming responsible citizens. Now we tested that last year in Scotland, where the 16 and 17-year-olds got a vote, and I think it was proved right. I mean, they are capable of being responsible citizens, but it's not going to happen without preparation through the school system. Effective communicators, people who can communicate with others of different cultures, different backgrounds, different languages, and so on. That's one of the main aims of education, to help with effective communication. Confident individuals. We saw some confident individuals this morning, didn't we, on the stage, who were able to sing, not just to complete strangers, but to their fellow pupils. And that's tricky, isn't it? standing up there, exposed, on the stage, singing, you don't know what kind of response you'll get, and young people prepared to speak in a language that wasn't their own, about some things to do with the school. Yeah, confident individuals, people who are confident in their abilities because they know about themselves as learners. And the last one there, which is maybe the one that's the most important in terms of education, is giving everybody the chance to become a successful learner. Generations of people in my country have left school as failures. They've taken away an idea for themselves as people are not intelligent, not very useful. And that's something I think that we can do something about. We can actually make everyone able to find the bits of learning that they actually can develop and become good at. Okay, it's nearly finished. You'll be glad to hear. I've done it again. So, what would be some of the offshoots of talking and learning, or pupil voice? Well, for me, one of the big challenges, I think, is that I don't think there's enough emphasis placed on thinking as an activity in education. It's something that we take for granted. Those of you know the Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So in other words, there's a kind of suggestion, well, we're human beings and so we think. That's the end of the story. Well, actually it's not. There's lots of types of thinking. Critical thinking, creative thinking, problem solving. There's a whole literature that's been written about thinking. And I've got a feeling that if you want young people to be successful in the 21st century, then they're going to have to master some of these things. Because the pace of change in the 21st century is probably going to be at least as fast and probably faster than the 20th century. So if you want to prepare them for the unknown, as well as the known, then becoming a successful thinker seems to me to be part and parcel of that. And most people do their best thinking with other people. Thinking, just knocking ideas around, talking, listening, and so on. So all of those kinds of things seem to me to point in the direction of more rather than less collaborative learning. The more kind of structured collaborative learning we can do, and some of the things that we heard this morning, and the more effective young people will become as learners. So I thought I'd just mention some people that you might want to explore at some point or another if you were interested in taking this further. There's a man called Jerome Bruner. Looking for any nods? People heard of Jerome Bruner? Jerome Bruner is regarded by some as the father of the thinking skills movement. Right? He was a professor at Harvard. I can still arrange smiling at me. I have to tell you my Jerome Bruner story. Jerome Bruner was the person who developed or mentored people like Howard Gardner, multiple intelligences man, David Perkins, who produced Teaching for Understanding. So I was involved with an organisation in Scotland where we were trying to run big conferences of teachers and bring people from all over the world to speak at these conferences. Indeed, one or two people from Finland as well. And we had Howard Gardner from Harvard, we had Ruben Feuerstein from Israel, we had a number of big names, and we sat around the table one day and said, who should we go for next? Who could we invite over to speak to Scottish teachers? And somebody said, what about Jerome Bruner? And there was a pause, a silence around the table. And it was because most people were thinking, is he still alive? So we Googled him. And yes, he was still alive, and he was 93. 93. Still teaching at a university in New York. So we emailed him and said, this is what we're doing. Sent him a copy of some material from Scotland. Would you like to come and speak? This was in October. And he said, yes, I'd love to come, but I can't come until a year in September because I've got commitments. And you're thinking, 93, a year in September. This is optimism, isn't it? Now he came. In fact, he came twice. He came 2 years in succession when he was, by then, 94-ish, 95. And he was a huge success, wasn't he? I mean, occasionally when he was doing his talk, he would wander. He would just kind of wander off the topic. And you could always see 2,000 people in this big auditorium kind of thinking, is he going to go back? And then he would go back. He would find his way back. It was a fascinating. And the point I'm making is that he, way back in the 1960s, made a really important declaration that not everybody would agree with. He argues that it's possible to teach any subject or any concept to any child of any age, provided you give the child a courteous translation. In other words, as long as you put it in words that the child can understand. Anything is possible. Whereas Piaget, do you remember Piaget? Jean Piaget said, no, you can't do any of that conceptual stuff until they're about 11 or 12. No, Bruno said, no. Very young children can understand concepts as long as they get them in a form they can understand. Challenging, isn't it? A challenging idea. Lev Vygotsky, I've told you about his issue about social interaction. Lev Vygotsky also said if a child appears to be unintelligent, if a child appears unable to understand something, do not assume the child is unintelligent. Rather assume the child's intelligence is lying dormant. It's sleeping. And so it's our challenge to wake it up. It's interesting, isn't it? Again, not everyone would agree with that, but it's an interesting idea. There's a man called Dylan William, who works now at the University of London, who's produced, kind of based on research, something called Assessment is for Learning. It's a big curriculum kind of project. And basically what he says is that what teachers do, the most successful teachers, is that they set out the goals of learning right at the beginning. So children know why they're doing the learning. Not only that, they ask open questions and they promote dialogue. Assessment is ongoing. It's not just a test at the end of it. And you want to try and get them to be involved in peer and self-assessment. Assessing their own work, assessing the work of others. It's interesting. So there's a big push on that in our country at the moment. And the last one is this one here, the woman called Jean Ruddock, who wrote this book called School Improvement. And the subheading is, what can pupils tell us? What can pupils tell us about how to make schools better? So, this is my last slide, I promise. Where's my last slide? I did have a last slide. Oh, there it is. So, anybody who's interested, that's just some kind of reading if you wanted to look at it. So I'll leave all these slides with you anyway, if you want them, if you wanted to look at them anyway. But I'll pause there just now because I'm conscious of the time and I wondered if anybody's got a question. At this point, by the way, I'm sure this is universal. This happens in any country in the world. At this point, people are saying, don't ask him a question. Don't ask him. He'll probably take 15 minutes to answer it, and we want to go to a coffee. Right? There's this kind of group thing that happens. But I promise, if somebody asks me a question, I'll answer it in 30 seconds. I promise. I promise. Look, it's a group thing. Oh, one more question.
I was very interested in what you said about learning to be.
Yes, yes.
How would you describe that in terms of what you can do
what
about
you can do in a class? You see, I think one of the things that, I don't know if it happens here, but when teachers in Scotland go on to do further study, let's say they want to go for a head teacher post or something, and they do management training as we call it, the first module, the first section they often go through is a piece of reflection. They're asked to reflect on themselves as a teacher. In other words, what kind of teacher am I? How did I become that kind of teacher? And so on. And we take it for granted that as teachers, knowing about yourself is going to make you a better teacher in the end. Now, I think we sometimes take for granted, when children come in, we take it for granted that they are who they are, and we can't influence that. But in a sense, if we can get them to talk about themselves, about how they see themselves, what they think they're good at, what they think they're not good at, just little ideas they have about the world, groups of other people, boys and girls and so on, the more you can get them to reflect on themselves, the more I think you begin to let them realise that you can actually improve your own learning. So for example, when I was going through the school system in Scotland, there was a system of IQ testing. Intelligence quotient. I don't know if it's still, just be careful, it doesn't happen in many of the countries, doesn't it? Because I'm about to say bad things about it. But the idea was, you see, that you could measure a human being's intelligence by by a test. And they would come up with a score. So the average would be 100, and if you were over the average, then you were clearly doing well. And if you were below the average, you weren't. And if you were really below the average, you didn't even get to school in the 1950s in my country. You were regarded as unable to be educated. If you were really low IQ, so it was really pretty important, this thing. But it was all based on a false premise. And the false premise was this, that every human being has a single thing called intelligence. You get it when you're born, but there may be a wee element of nurture as well, nature and nurture. So maybe your family circumstances might affect it a bit. But you can't change it. It's fixed. And once you measure it and put a number on it, then you can predict with certainty what's going to happen to you for the rest of your life. Now, it seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But that's how the education system functioned in many Western countries. As soon as you had a test and you'd got a score, that was it. And in my country, you went to one school if you got over 110, another type of school if you got less than that. So my point here is, if we can help young people to realise that their intelligence can actually be improved. In other words, what you've got at the moment isn't only what you'll have. If you do certain things, you can actually physically grow your brain. Bits of your brain can grow. There was a lovely experiment done by Howard Winston, Winston's his name, the doctor, Lord Winston. Guy in London, he was looking at how physical changes to the brain can be detected after certain types of learning. So he got a man in London who was about to try to become a London taxi driver. And to become a London taxi driver, you have to learn all of the streets in London, of which there are 1,000 at least, I have no idea. And not only that, you have to learn the ways to get from any one to any other as quickly as possible. And it takes about 3 months, and then you go and sit a test. So this man did this, went and sat the test, but before he started on this process, he took an MRI scan of his brain. And then when he did it and successfully got through the test, they did another MRI scan and found that one of the lobes of the brain connected with memory was bigger. He had grown his brain. Now I think if we can get children just to grasp the notion that they can actually help themselves to become better. It's not all down to somebody else. And this is equally important for youngsters who struggle with learning as those who find learning easy. Because in my country, at least, lots of young people get towards the end of secondary, they're very bright, learning's come easy for them, they then choose a subject, say, it doesn't matter what subject it is, and they find a problem with it. What do? They give up immediately. Or they blame somebody, normally you, they blame the teacher. In other words, they've got a notion of themselves which is fixed. Whereas what I would want everybody to have would be a notion of themselves which is about growth. I am who I am at the moment, but I can become something else if I work hard enough at it, or if I know how to improve and so on. And I think that's where the learning to be comes in. You know, you're not restricted by someone else's view of you, whether it's through an IQ test or that kind of thing. Oh, that was a long answer. You were right not to ask. I don't want any more questions. It's time to go.
Okay, thank you very much.